The views expressed in this podcast are solely our own. This information is provided for your convenience. It does not constitute legal advice, nor does it create an attorney-client relationship. Prior results do not guarantee similar outcomes. This is attorney advertising. Enjoy. Hi, welcome again to Red Flags Rising. My name is Mike Hunnicky. I'm a partner at Morgan, Lewis & Bockius, LLP in the International Trade and National Security Practice. With me yet again is my good friend, Brent Carlson of Red Flags Rising Solutions, LLC. Today is Monday, December 15th, just around 4 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time. Brent, how are you doing today?
Thanks, Mike. Great to be here to talk with you as always.
Well, Brent, I'm excited. We have a special guest with us today, Severin Wirz, like me, a recovering Foreign Corrupt Practices Act attorney who has recently published a book, Bribery Beyond Borders, the story of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. We're very excited to have him on the show. We'll have him join us in a little bit. Brent, set the stage.
I thought this was very interesting because we both came across this book, and as you mentioned, we both have extensive FCPA experience. What was very interesting about this is looking at the origins of the FCPA and comparing them to the new origins of export controls today.
Absolutely.
The origins of the FCPA came up in the context of national security issues. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act came about through twists and turns. That fascinating story is detailed in Severin's book. It also was driven by the geopolitical context of the time, driven by national security issues.
One thing that Severin does exceptionally well in this book, Brent, is that he highlights that what is the national security interest, what is the national security objective, and how best to achieve it is oftentimes a matter of serious debate. His book highlights how even members of the U.S. Senate from the same party on the same committee had different views about how best to achieve that. So I highly recommend it for anyone who's interested in how the sausage is made in American politics. We're very lucky to have him on the show. Let's bring him on. Severin, we're very happy to have you join us on this episode of Red Flags Rising. Brent and I have both read your recent book, Bribery Beyond Borders. Welcome to the pod.
Mike, thanks for having me, and thank you, Brent. Hey, Mike, I should probably note that I'm here in my personal capacity. I do have a day job where I'm a director of compliance at a semiconductor equipment manufacturer in Silicon Valley. All the opinions that I'm expressing today are my own.
Yeah, Severin, we really enjoyed reading this book. I think there's a lot of lessons to take away. Why don't we just dive right in? Writing this book, I noticed, was an incredible feat over a 12-year journey. What inspired you to write it?
Thanks. It was a long journey. I've heard said before that all books are autobiographies. Certainly that's true for this one. I've been in the FCPA space for 15 plus years. About 15 years ago, I was working on a case called the Bonny Island case that involved a liquefied natural gas project in Nigeria. The client I was representing at the time, a Japanese company, they were recidivists in a sense because they had been involved in a case involving bribery from the 1970s, researching who they were and trying to figure out what the penalties might entail. I got interested in what the history of the FCPA was back then. There are certain kinds of people, certain kinds of attorneys who, in order to understand how to practice in a certain field, I think find it necessary to understand the why behind what it is that they do. Both you and Mike are similar in that sense. That's what really started me down the path of trying to understand, okay, what happened 50 years ago? What is the legislative history behind the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act? At the time, I really didn't know where it was going to lead me until I started looking at the material. This incredible story started to emerge that I felt really hadn't been told before and needed to be. Even though I haven't written any books before, this is my first one, and I may not be the greatest storyteller or writer, I thought that the material itself could carry a book. So I kept researching and I started to write it as time went on, and I was interviewing people who were involved in passing the statute. Some of them, unfortunately, started to pass away, especially around COVID-19, and that really compelled me to want to tell their story and to finish the book. So it took a long time. I held down a couple of different jobs and started a family. And so it was a long journey, but I'm glad that I was able in the end to tell their story and to get this book out there.
The why is really important, especially when you're talking about all those other things going on in your day job and in your personal life. To be able to power through and stay on top of a really long-term task like this, the why does have to matter. And you're absolutely right about that. It's important for all of us to think about, why are we here? Why are the laws here that we're trying to help clients to navigate? And having that sense of historical perspective can really ground the other arguments that you want to make and put them in the relevant time and place where everything happened. I was struck in particular, not even by the legislative history, Severin, but by the political history that you wove seamlessly throughout this. I had been familiar myself a little bit with the suicide of Eli Black and how that played into at least some of the earlier interest in anti-corruption in the United States around that time. But when I started your chapter on that topic with him going with his family to see a play the night before, I was like, oh, this guy has really dug in. We are going deep. But it was awesome. So thank you from all of us for doing that kind of legwork to build this story.
Yeah, I definitely go in deep. The book focuses mostly on the events between 1975 and 1977 that led to passage of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and it tries to answer the question why. Why did the United States become the first country in the history of the world to outlaw bribery outside of its own borders? That's really the premise, but it's written largely as narrative nonfiction, meaning that the events are presented through the lives of the people involved, and those characters are developed over the course of the book, much like you might find in a novel or some literary work. So yeah, I really try to explain who these people were, what their motivations were, what the pressures were that they face. And then throughout, I also try to weave in an explanation of the context for some of the events that were happening at the same time, the cultural milieu, the political and legal context that influenced the passage of the statute. So I'm glad that we found that it worked. That was what I was trying to aim for.
I know Brent is one who loves scandals, so I think he had some questions for you about the scandals that you cover.
Yeah, the tagline of the book is how scandal, courage, and world politics redefined corporate ethics, and what the origins of the FCPA reveal about our ongoing fight against corruption. It could be interesting to dive into some of these. Let's start with some of the scandals that led to the legislative hearings and the movements in Congress that then built momentum over time that created this entirely new beast of the FCPA.
Yeah, thanks, Brent. The book, you're right, primarily looks at how these bribery allegations played themselves out in the public sphere. Primarily, I look at 4 different companies involved in overseas bribery. For each of these companies, I try to explain the bribes themselves, how they were uncovered, and the lengths to which the companies went to prevent that from happening. Some tried to make appeals to Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, some stonewalled congressional inquiries, and some simply lied until they were caught. In a lot of ways, that's ultimately what makes for a good scandal. It's not just what happened, which is usually something in the public interest, but also how what happened gets revealed. So if we think of modern scandals, the cover-up often matters just as much as the crime. It was the same back then, where there was this wonderful game of cat and mouse with various factions within the government fighting both to expose, in some instances, and conceal, in other instances, the bribes, as well as an active media applying pressure from outside. And then, of course, as with any scandal, there's the aftermath. Understandably, that's what attracted most of the attention in this case. When all was said and done, the revelation that these 4 companies were engaged in overseas bribes impacted heads of state across the globe, including Honduras, the Netherlands, Italy, Saudi Arabia, South Korea, Japan. Those are just some of them. Presidents had to resign. A former prime minister was imprisoned. A royal family was almost forced to abdicate the throne. What that looked like in real time was just this huge global event that really captured the imagination of the American public for several years. Much of that we know as background to the FCPA, but I tried to really bring those events to life for the reader.
You can imagine many instances on that timeline, Severin, where if the media attention had dried up, or frankly, if the disclosures had dried up, that we might have ended up with a much different Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, if one at all. But I got the sense from reading your reconstruction of those events, like it's just a constant and increasing drumbeat of scandals too salacious to be avoided and really compelled action and empowered those who wanted there to be action to get it done.
And scandals that almost didn't happen, right? There were several instances where Congress was almost at a dead end, if not for one or two things that happened, some of which were completely serendipitous, that allowed the truth to come out. We can go into what some of that was, the investigative reporting, the civil servants involved who leaked some of this information to the press. What was so enjoyable about writing this book is going through all the twists and turns, and then as a practitioner, realizing, wow, we take for granted this law that exists today, but it almost never happened.
I think that part is really interesting because it's one thing to be in a particular environment where the ground rules have been established and the momentum is already going, right? It's like the train has left the station. But before the train leaves the station, it's really interesting because you may not even get on the tracks. I like the stories that you give in there about how it almost didn't. And it was quite serendipitous that certain events happened, which then triggered those sort of Malcolm Gladwell-like tipping points.
Yeah, this goes a little bit against the traditional story that we tell of how the FCPA came to be. So typically, that story is that the Securities and Exchange Commission, in investigating corporate payments that were made to Nixon's reelection campaign as a result of the Watergate inquiry, revealed payments that were being made overseas to foreign government officials, and then they referred those cases to Congress for further investigation. In interrogating the archives and talking to people who were involved, what I came to realize is that was really only partially true. Some of this was uncovered by the SEC, but as I mentioned earlier, the Department of State intervened on behalf of these companies because of diplomatic concerns. And there was a lot of debate within the SEC among the commissioners as to whether it was appropriate for the commission to bring charges against companies for overseas bribery. So the SEC had to sit on it for a while, and it wasn't until a group of reporters at the Wall Street Journal, prompted by the suicide of Eli Black that Mike mentioned earlier, uncovered that the company had secretly been paying multi-million-dollar bribes to the head of state of Honduras. That's what ultimately led to the front page news and the dam to break that allowed the SEC's enforcement division to charge that company and then to bring other suits. That story really fits a pattern in American history. Most big corruption scandals are the result of investigative journalism. This goes all the way back to Harper's Weekly and Tammany Hall and the Credit Mobilier scandal in the 1800s. You see it again with Teapot Dome scandal in the 1920s, and the Wall Street Journal investigated that affair. It goes to show the importance of the Fourth Estate in bringing facts to light.
What's interesting here, too, is that investigative reporting and the underlying actions themselves, for that matter, they occur in a geopolitical environment, in a domestic political environment that's influenced by the geopolitical environment. That then drives this whole thing forward. There's the saying, the rising tide raises all boats, and the momentum just builds. The issues on foreign bribery came up in the context of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that and how that was a driver in making these investigative reports resonate within that wider geopolitical zeitgeist.
Brent, it's an excellent question. It's true that scandal really resonated within a much larger context. You're right to bring up the Cold War. Most people, when we talk about the FCPA, talk about it in terms of post-Watergate morality, but it's actually much bigger than that. First, it's helpful to understand the general political environment surrounding multinational corporations at the time. Today, these large companies are such an ingrained feature of our daily lives. It's hard to realize that the way we think of them today is really a recent phenomenon. 50 years ago, people were only beginning to take stock of the role that corporations were starting to take in shaping the global economy. The rate of change was just incredible. In the post-war period, corporations were moving operations overseas. They were merging with one another to become these huge conglomerates and amassing tons of wealth. Multinationals were also primarily US based. The United States today, I believe, accounts for about 10 to 15% of global trade. But back then in the 1970s, it was closer to 50%. This is a huge amount of change that set the backdrop for all of the events that were happening. Corporations weren't always viewed positively. A lot of these companies were beginning to generate more and more of their profit outside of the United States. The 1970s is when you begin to hear of the idea of outsourcing, where US manufacturing jobs start to move to lower cost locations in other parts of the world. Combined with a general slowdown in the economy, multinationals were increasingly portrayed negatively in popular culture. You also see around this time in the 1960s and early 70s, Ralph Nader and the consumer rights movement, as well as the general counterculture movement and backlash against Vietnam, which saw protests against companies because of their role in the Vietnam War. This is the context in which the hearings into bribery occurred, and there's this increasing apprehension by the early 1970s that multinationals were wielding too much power, and that they didn't always use that power to benefit Americans, and sometimes they may have actually been using it to harm the image of the United States in the context of the Cold War. That's the narrative that existed at the outset of the bribery hearings, and that's how Congress saw the dangers of U.S. companies bribing foreign officials. In pursuing profits, they could be undermining U.S. foreign policy and national security interests. The easiest example of this that I talk about in the book is in Italy. Communists won in a landslide in local elections once those revelations came out. There was this real sense that multinationals, if left to their own devices, could in fact be aiding communist propaganda about the evils of American capitalism in this existential threat of competing ideologies between the free market democracy advocated by the United States and communism advocated by the Soviet Union. There was this sense that multinational corporations might be contributing to the opposite worldview.
That's a good example of how nothing really happens in a vacuum, right? It's impossible to predict exactly how these things will ricochet through global and national life. It's not a linear path. It's not a straight line path that anyone was able to walk. In your book, the discussion about Congress is fascinating. For anyone familiar with American history around this time, they might first think of Senator Frank Church as being involved in the intelligence community hearings, but also important to him were these hearings on multinational corporations. And exactly as you said, Severin, the harm that they were potentially doing to American national security by what they were doing around the world. There's also the reality that we're all humans fumbling our way through this. The fact that personal relationships between some of the senators involved in particular influenced what happened and when it happened, not for any logical reason or not because of some kind of principled debate about what would be the most effective way to write the FCPA, but petty personal stuff had a role in what happened and why. To throw another metaphor in there, another historical quote, it's why people don't really want to see how the sausage is made sometimes, to quote Bismarck on that.
That was actually the title for one of the chapters initially, was How the Sausage Gets Made, and then I changed it in later drafts. But you're absolutely right that the FCPA, for a lot of reasons, has been monumentalized, which is okay, but we tend to think of it as this amazing statute that was handed from up high. When you look into how actually some of the provisions came to be, you realize, as you said, that there were petty personal relationships and competitiveness between some of the senators as to why one provision should be in and not another that had nothing to do with bribery, actually, and it had a lot more to do with personal ambitions, particularly between Senator Frank Church and Senator Hubert Humphrey and their actual outright animosity for one another, even though they were both within the same party. We might have had a very different statute had one personality won out over the other, but in teasing out those relationships, it's interesting to look at what we actually ended up with.
Related to that, it was interesting when you talk about those personalities and the conflicts between them, and then how things at different points in time were really touch and go. It'd be interesting to explore some of the stories of courage that stood out in your book and in your journey in researching it. Any ones that particularly stand out for you?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, what's amazing about the story of the FCPA is so much of it could have gone another way if not for individual people stepping up and taking things into their own hands and doing things that put them at great personal risk sometimes. Foreign bribery was still a topic that was very much taboo. One of them I talk about a lot in the book is Stanley Sporkin, and a lot of people already know the story of Stanley Sporkin. He is considered by some as the kind of godfather of the FCPA. He was the head of enforcement at the SEC. He faced incredible pushback, both from his own bosses, the SEC's commissioners, and from others in the federal government who sought to impede his investigations into foreign bribery. But he was somebody who viewed his ultimate obligation as one that was owed to the American people. Whenever he hit a roadblock, he would find a way to get around it. Sometimes that would involve leaking the reports that he had to Congress in order to continue whatever investigation he was hindered from pursuing himself. Doing so not only risked his reputation, but likely his job. He managed to do it without ever getting caught. What I uncovered in researching the book was that he was definitely the source for several leaks to Frank Church's subcommittee in ways that I don't think have been fully appreciated before. Another person was Takeo Miki. He was the Japanese prime minister who pursued the investigation despite intense pressure from within his own party and from the much more powerful Liberal Democratic Party leader and former prime minister Tanaka. One newspaper that I found predicted that Tanaka would, quote, devour Miki. That's the word they used, which is why many in Japan expected the scandal to get swept under the rug, like many corruption scandals before it. The fact that Miki decided to stick with the investigation, even if it meant turning against someone within his own party, is noteworthy and I think speaks to his character. We've talked already a lot about Frank Church. I think the other person I'll mention is a Wisconsin Senator, William Proxmire. Proxmire was the one who was able to get the bill over the finish line, despite a lot of forces in Washington who would have preferred for the whole mess to just go away. As I learned in reading a biography by Proxmire's ex-wife, Ellen Proxmire, he was somebody who had been voted in high school not as, quote, most likely to succeed, but really as biggest grind. That was the trait that he needed to push the FCPA forward through Congress. It wasn't just other Congress people across the aisle that he needed to convince, but also people within the White House, both within the Ford administration and also within the Carter administration, who were highly skeptical of it. If it hadn't been for him, somebody who had an enormous persistence, we probably would not have had the FCPA come to fruition.
Those are incredible stories. So I guess it shows that courage and persistence do pay off in the end.
In this example, yes.
It's interesting. Our generation takes the FCPA a bit for granted. Severin, you were talking about the post-Watergate morality as a phrase that was used. It took me a while to realize, oh, that's actually a negative statement. It's a criticism of this holier-than-thou, goody-two-shoes almost morality that some were highlighting as a critique against laws like the FCPA and other things that were being done. It was a mentality shift for me.
I'm glad you picked up on that. That was the point that I really wanted to try to emphasize in the book, because so many people, in trying to answer the question, why did the United States pass this statute, attribute it to a post-Watergate morality. You're right that that term is seen as somewhat innocuous. It's actually just seen as factual that after Watergate, there was this sort of reform efforts. And looking at how the term came about, it was used as a political term with a lot of weight at the time. Reform efforts to change Congress, to change the federal government after Nixon's resignation were viewed as overly puritanical. There's a reason it came to be, and the term was coined by Vice President Spiro Agnew in his resignation speech because he was bitter at what was going on around him. A lot of people around that time started to use that terminology to describe the backlash against reform politics at the time. What I realized is that that term started to be attributed to the FCPA almost immediately and has continued to become part of FCPA lore. There have been academics who have said that it was a knee-jerk reaction to Watergate and that there was a sense that cooler minds did not prevail because there was so much activity in government to reform anything that was seen as corruption post-1974. In reality, what I tried to do is tie the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act to a much longer storyline of anti-corruption reform efforts in America, going all the way back to the early parts of the 20th century. The term Corrupt Practices Act is borrowed from the Federal Corrupt Practices Act of 1910 and the amendments in 1925, which itself was borrowed from an English law from the 1800s. There's a long history of reform and anti-corruption efforts, including anti-corruption efforts overseas. I mentioned Teapot Dome scandal earlier. In fact, that scandal revealed that US companies were engaged in overseas bribery in ways that were leading the United States almost to war with Mexico. 10 years later, there were merchants of war hearings in the 1930s that looked at how bribes by armaments companies had led the United States to war in World War I. There's actually an entire anti-corruption ethic, to borrow a term that was first used by John Noonan in his treatise called Bribes. But there's a larger arc here to anti-corruption reform that led to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in 1977 that I think is often lost when we oversimplify it by just referring to post-Watergate morality.
So glad you brought up Judge Noonan's book. I think he published it in 84, if I remember right. It's just called Bribes. It is such a fascinating and detailed history. He goes back even to ancient Egypt, and he highlights the fact that because the Egyptians had developed ways to objectively measure the weight of grain, that prompted people to realize that other people were lying to them, or that people were cheating, or that people were doing corrupt acts around grain sales, including bribing Egyptian judges. Going back to first principles like you did for this research was really fascinating.
It's worth going back to the question around the geopolitical context in the Cold War, just to remind listeners what was going on around this time. Congress was voting on whether to open an investigation. The vote took place on April 30th, 1975. That's actually the same day as Marines were exiting Saigon. It's the fall of Saigon. This was all happening really in the midst of what was still very much a hot Cold War. Vietnam itself was viewed through the lens of corruption, right? The South Vietnamese government had been terribly corrupt in ways that had lost credibility by its own population. The same issues were repeating themselves in Cambodia around the time of these hearings, where the Cambodian government that had been propped up by the US fell to the Khmer Rouge largely because of corruption. There was a lot of discussion around this time around what was going on in Libya. Libya had been a monarchy and had just been subject to a coup by Muammar Gaddafi, largely because companies had been bribing the king, so much so that Muammar Gaddafi was able to come to power on an anti-corruption platform. We saw this as well in the Philippines with Ferdinand Marcos. All over the world, really, there was this sense that corruption was inhibiting the United States from being able to put in place safe and stable democracies, and that could have real national security repercussions for our own country. That message was clearly articulated to the American public, especially the one in Libya, because Muammar Gaddafi, through OPEC, as soon as he came to power, increased oil prices at a time when Americans were having to ration oil because of the Arab embargo. There was a lot going on at this time that Congress was able to do to bring the corruption issue right to the American pocketbook and right to the American conscience of what was going on in the world at the time. These weren't academic bribes happening in other parts of the world. These were things that directly impacted the United States and its positioning in the Cold War.
Seems like it was really a national security issue at the time.
It was. Yeah, exactly. It was a national security issue. That's how it was positioned. By enabling corruption overseas, it wasn't just about promoting democracy, it was actually about fighting communists.
That has some interesting questions for the FCPA going forward. We live in a world of uncertainty. Countries around the world are facing their own challenges, how to address those, and how, from the United States' perspective of supporting stable, friendly regimes, the history of the FCPA, as you describe it in the book here, and in that context of the Cold War and that national security environment, gives one a lot to think about for what we're all facing today.
Only a few years ago, it would have seemed odd, but we are starting to talk about a new Cold War, new great power competition happening between the United States and China. Certainly, national security is front and center in terms of thinking about our economic policy and our regulations. All of the stuff around trade that you guys know so well is all centered around national security interests. When we think about corruption in the FCPA, sometimes it's mischaracterized as something that creates economic insecurity for the United States by putting us at a competitive disadvantage. But that's not at all how it was viewed in the 1970s when the statute was first passed. It was passed, in fact, to fill a national security gap. By regulating multinationals, they were able to restrain some of their worst impulses that threatened democracy abroad, and it made the United States weaker.
From a company's perspective, in many ways, having the FCPA can be a relief of sorts. Because yes, you do have scandals, and some companies out there, some individuals out there may be more inclined to engage in corrupt behavior and giving bribes. But at the end of the day, I think a smart business person is going to look at it, and that's really not core to the business. And it's not core to achieving long-term success in the marketplace. It's actually a distortion of it. It's really a pain in the behind to be faced with these challenges in operating in these environments around the globe, in markets where that specter does arise. It's helpful for business. Smart business people will look at it and they go, great, this is actually helpful because I then can compete in a fair marketplace, on a fair playing field, based upon my product, my service, my people. That helps economic competition.
Yeah, in researching this book, what I uncovered was that the first impulse to draft legislation had actually come from Bob Dorsey, who was the CEO of Gulf Oil. During the investigations, he had actually pleaded with Congress to pass a law that would allow his company to say no to demands to pay bribes overseas. So that's actually been a very consistent argument for why we need this statute, is that it actually in some ways protects businesses operating overseas who may be in environments where the rule of law is weaker, to say, well, even if I'm not going to get in trouble in your country, I would be getting in trouble in my own country if I paid this bribe, so I can't.
It's interesting because there's at least a Hollywood movie vibe that do whatever it takes is what the bold people do to best serve their country's interests. It may seem a bit soft and may not sell as many tickets at the box office, but in reality might be a better play to think about rule of law and morality and not doing something that is actually going to play into your adversary's hands, even if it seems like the expedient thing to do at the time. Severin, you just published this book. What are your thoughts about where the FCPA stands today? It was put on pause from an enforcement perspective earlier this year. New guidance was issued. We were just at the ACI 42nd annual conference on the FCPA, where the public statements from U.S. officials were about how the law is still very much in play and still very much alive, and that enforcement is still very much a priority. Where do we go from here in terms of the FCPA?
Mike, you're right that at the conference we both just attended, there was a lot of talk about the future of the FCPA being pretty bright, despite the executive order earlier this year putting a pause on the FCPA. Enforcement of the statute is not going away. We're still seeing cases being brought. What's still an open question is, what are the priorities of the U.S. Department of Justice? Which cases are they going to be bringing, and which cases will they be dismissing, and why are they going to be making some of those decisions? In the last few weeks alone, we've seen a clear prioritization of cases involving cartels and allegations of bribery in South America. People were saying after the executive order that we were not going to see any FCPA cases for the next 4 years. That prediction has not come true. But I still think there are some questions as to what flavor the FCPA is going to have under this administration and what it's going to mean for the larger anti-corruption movement.
Thanks to your book, I think people will approach that debate much more well-informed than they otherwise would.
It's helpful to have a historical perspective here, because what we're seeing is a large-scale shift that goes beyond just this administration, in my opinion. Allegations by other countries that FCPA enforcement has been politicized aren't new. Other countries have accused the United States of not just leveling the playing field, but rather seeking to tilt it in its own favor. Now we see the global economy shift away from globalization into a model characterized perhaps more by weaponized economic interdependence. The geopolitical environment is starting to shift as well from a unipolar one to a multipolar one. The challenge ahead is that to change the perception of the FCPA, we need to think about the perception of the United States more broadly and the role it will play in this new emerging world order. Is it going to be a return to liberalism as a kind of global police force, or is it going to be something more pluralistic with a kind of patchwork of laws loosely revolving around supporting democracy and free trade? I don't know the answer to that. Whatever the answer is, I think that is likely to decide the future of the FCPA.
If the world shrinks or disconnects a bit, that would put U.S. firms more and more on an island in terms of being exposed to this law compared to others. One of the big successes of the 90s was the signing of the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention as a cornerstone of trying to level the playing field for U.S. businesses as U.S. businesses went out into the world. If that goes from just south of 40 signatories to 10 or 12 or whatever it might be, in the worst case scenario, obviously that's a different playing field.
We're still trying to figure out what the future global economy is going to look like. It's clearly not going to be the globalized economy from the 90s and early 2000s that you and I were accustomed to growing up. It's probably going to be much more fractured with certain trading blocks. The question is, what are those trading blocks going to look like? I do think you're right that the OECD convention did a lot of good in terms of leveling the playing field, but we've got to figure out how to reinvent the FCPA for the new economy that's emerging.
It'll be interesting to see how the whole global economic order does shake out. The world is breaking into different trading blocks, and it's going to be interesting to see among those different competing trading blocks, who's going to be able to put this together? Because I think it's going to come down to economic competitiveness. If you can get to the point where then you level that playing field among firms within that particular trading block, then that ends up creating much stronger firms that can compete and innovate over others that are in an environment that don't have that.
Agreed.
Well, Severin, all this stuff is super important for policymakers today as they think about the path to chart for the future. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, and let me just again say thanks to both of you for inviting me on this podcast. For anyone out there who practices under the FCPA, understanding the history of the statute is important. What I hope this book achieves is to show that the history can also be interesting and entertaining. I wrote the book I wish I had had when I started out my career, so I hope that fulfills that need for others who might be out there. The other thing I'll say, and I will wax a little philosophical here, is that corruption, more than we sometimes realize, is a social construct. We think of it as some static legal definition, but it's actually a concept that keeps changing and evolving over time. So the story of the FCPA is about how once upon a time, the United States decided that overseas corruption mattered, not only to the promotion of democracy, but to our free enterprise system. It became, in a collective sense, a new national priority. That vision has changed over the years. It'll be interesting to see how it gets rearticulated again for the world we see emerging today. I'll close by saying that whatever policy emerges, it's necessarily going to start with people. People make policy, and they make policy by building narratives. So whether it's journalists or civil servants, politicians or nonprofits or business leaders, each of them is pushing a narrative as to the world we live in, the risks we face, and the solutions we need. I'll just go back to our favorite mentor of sorts, the Ninth Circuit Judge John Noonan, who once said, and I'm paraphrasing here a little bit, but in order for bribery to exist as a legal concept, it first has to exist in the minds of regular people. That was certainly the case 50 years ago when Frank Church and others helped shape global corruption in the minds of the American public in passing the FCPA. It continues to be true today as we think about how to keep the statute alive for the next 50 years. So thank you.
Well, you're most welcome. And honestly, I can't think of a better way to end than on those words. Brent, anything else you want to say before we conclude Severin's part?
Thanks, Severin. There was a lot of food for thought here and helpful perspectives for a lot of folks going forward. I really appreciate you coming in and taking the time to talk about the book and its journey and the observations, key takeaways and lessons learned. I think it was really helpful, and thank you very much.
Brent, that was an awesome discussion with Severin. Lots of valuable lessons in how America fumbles and stumbles its way to national security laws and policy. There are a lot of interesting lessons and anecdotes in terms of the debate today, Brent, around export controls. There may be a managing up in there. What is your managing up for this episode, Brent?
There's a saying in the Talmud that if you save one person, you save the entire world. I think what that reflects is that one person does have the power to change the entire world. So it takes courage to be able to do that. Doing that inspires other people to take steps towards courage as well. Today, we see these same factors in play with export controls that we saw in the early days of the FCPA. We see geopolitical stress, trends, and dynamics that are pushing things in directions that in some ways they're new, in some ways they're not. We see the same sort of potential scandals in investigative reporting. We're seeing continuous hearings in Congress as solutions are found to address these issues, which not only are not going away, but there needs to be effective solutions to these. What I like about Severin's book are the profiles of courage within it. It comes down to people. I totally believe that. You can have the best organization, you can have the best technology, you can have the best product in the world, but at the end of the day, it comes down to people, and it comes down to individual decisions that individual people make. They take courage in their actions and their decisions, and then collectively that can really add up to great things. So in these days, I think let's just ask ourselves, who will be, or even already are, the new heroes of our time? Collectively, we can all deal with the challenges that we're facing today, and we can all make this world a better and safer place.
Brent, well said as always. That concludes this episode of Red Flags Rising. Brent, be well.
Thanks, Mike. Be well. And to everyone else out there, be well and have a happy and healthy holiday season.